Hello, welcome back to my channel. I know it's a little bit late, but I still wanted to talk to you about all the books I read in October. I have read some really interesting books in October, so let's just get into them. I started the month by finishing an audiobook by a Dutch author, which was called Gevalletje Borderline by Kathelijn Hulshof. And this book is part of a series that a Dutch publisher is putting out, all on different mental health or neurodiverse topics. I have read 3 other books in this series, which were on autism, ADHD and anxiety, and then this one is on borderline personality disorder. And all these books follow a very similar format. In the books, the author tells their personal story, and all of them were diagnosed as adults. So they talk about their childhood and if there were any signs toward their future diagnoses. They talk about the process of getting diagnosed, about the different types of therapy and maybe medication they've had. So sort of how the diagnosis has influenced their life in a good or maybe bad way, and what it might mean for their career or their relationships. These books are published with a publisher who also brings out a lot of YA books, and I think they're great for opening up a conversation around mental health. These are very accessible books. They tell a personal story, but then they are also very practical. For example, they talk about, what boxes from the DSM I had to tick to get this diagnosis, but then also what those boxes actually mean in their daily lives. And I think they're great books to give you an introduction to different disorders. This one in particular was about borderline personality disorder, which I knew very little about, besides some very stereotyped stigmas. So it was great to learn a little bit more and to see what the author's experience was. Yeah, so if you speak Dutch and you're looking for some introductory books on these topics, then I would definitely recommend checking them out. Next, I read The Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Roffey, which I read together with Alex of Stay at Home Reader, and I think we both really enjoyed discussing this book and had a very similar reaction to it. This book is set on a fictional Caribbean island called Black Conch, and it's written as journal entries or the memoirs of this man called David. And he tells the story of how he met a mermaid. So David is a fisherman, and in the beginning of the book he is out at sea playing some guitar while waiting for a catch, when this mermaid surfaces from the water and starts listening to his music. And this happens a couple of times, and there develops this sort of curiosity between them. And then one day there's a big fishing competition on the island, and the mermaid gets caught by some rich American tourists. David ends up rescuing the mermaid from the Americans, and takes her home with the intention of setting her free again. However, that gets postponed and the story moves from there. So when I was reading this book, I had some very mixed feelings about it. I really enjoyed reading some parts, but I didn't always like the way the relationship between David and the mermaid, who is called Akea, how that relationship developed. Some parts I'd be really interested in the story and what it set out to explore, but then it would take a turn again that really frustrated me. I know that sounds kind of vague, but I don't want to give too much away. I think this is definitely a great book to read with someone else, like I did with Alex, or maybe in a book club setting. It has a lot to unpack and a lot of different themes to explore, and the book just really allows for some great discussion. For example, the background story is based on a legend of the indigenous people of the Caribbean, where a young girl gets cursed by the other women in her community because supposedly she's too promiscuous and she steals and lures away the men from their wives. And they curse her to be a mermaid and literally locking up her sex in a fishtail. So you could perhaps discuss how the mythology of mermaids fits into that. Mermaids are often portrayed as very mysterious but also sensual creatures that have been luring sailors and fishermen into their depths, and that this curse almost has an opposite effect of what the women intended with the curse, in that there's a certain intrigue and power that mermaids hold over men. Maybe if the curse got lifted, it wouldn't only mean a certain kind of freedom, but it would also come with a price of being more vulnerable and losing some of the power that the mermaid had. There is something to unpack in the urge of men wanting to dominate the female body and wanting to have power over it, which in this book gets especially clear in the scene where the American tourists capture the mermaid. Another big element of the book is colonialism. The island where this book is set has an obvious history of slavery, and one of the main characters in the book is a lady whose family or ancestors had owned plantations, and she still lives in her old family home, and she's still one of the more wealthy and influential people on the island. And it is interesting to explore her role in the community she lives in, and how her family's history influences the way she interacts with other people on the island, and how people perceive her. And this colonialism also comes back again with the Americans capturing the mermaid and claiming to have a right to own her, just because they were the ones who captured her, and this sort of sense of entitlement they have. One thing Alex really picked up on and pointed out was the parallel between Achaia, the mermaid, and trans identity. Achaia throughout the story transforms between being more human, being more woman, and being more fish, more mermaid. At some points people will still call her a fish, even when she's fully in the body of a woman, and how that can be very similar to the way society reacts to trans people. Sort of refusing to acknowledge their identity. So yeah, lots of different angles you can take when reading this book, and I'm sure other people will pick up on different things still. For me at least, I felt like even if I don't always liked where the plot went or the decisions the characters made, I feel like it's still a book with a lot to offer. Another book that has a lot to chew on is The Seep by Chana, which is a sci-fi novel with actual aliens in it, which is definitely not something I would usually gravitate towards. But it was recommended to me by another Marcella on Instagram, and I usually trust her recommendations. So, how to explain this book? It is set at some point in the future, and and the Earth has been invaded by an alien entity called the Seep. And when you get into contact with it as a human being, it will sort of get into you, into your bloodstream, like almost on a cellular level. And there is several things that happen to you once the Seep enters your body. One way is that you feel connected to everyone and everything around you, but also connected to yourself in a way that makes you see the implications of your actions. For example, it is one thing to know that smoking is bad for you, but with the Seep you could actually feel the cells in your body struggling to get enough oxygen. You'd feel very much connected to the planet, so if you did something that was bad for the environment, you'd also physically feel that in yourself because you're part of the planet. And the other thing is that the Seep allows you to change anything in yourself. So this could be anything from like changing the color of your hair, but you could also change your sex, you can change into an animal, you can grow wings, you can revert into a baby, you can heal yourself of any illnesses, and that also means that death is something that you choose. So that all makes this book a really great thought experiment. What could happen if all the rules and the frameworks of society today and of how the world works are gone? It's, you know, out of the box thinking on a whole different level, and I love that this book gives you the space to explore that. But as a story itself, I found it a bit lacking. I'm really struggling to remember what actually happened in the book. It starts off with a trans woman, Trina, and her wife, Deba. They're sort of living very happily in this utopian society. And then Deba decides she wants to be reborn as a baby because she's had a very hard childhood, and she wants to give herself a more happy childhood, and she wants Trina to be her mother. But Trina doesn't want anything of this to happen, and she ends up running away, and then the story moves from there. So it obviously deals with topics like grief and love and loss. I love how the book explores this topic. It's very much a book of ideas, but for me it just lacked a little bit of focus, and I felt a bit lost sometimes. But still a great book if you want to read something that pushes the boundaries. And then this was a reread for me, Mastering the Art of Soviet Cooking by Anya from Bremzen. I read this a couple of years ago for the first time when I picked it up on a recommendation of a book Olive. Olive really likes this book, so you can take her word for it. In this book, the author and her mother decide to cook one typical Russian meal that they feel is really quintessential food, Russian food from each decade. So they start with the 1910s with the last of the Tsars, and then all the way up to 21st century Russia and Putin. And she uses this as a framework to tell her personal and her family's history. She was born in Russia in the 1960s, and she grew up living in a communal flat in Moscow, and she eventually immigrated with her family to the United States in the 1970s. And she combines that with important historical and political events happening in Russia at the time. And I think the combination of the grander history of Russia and the personal history with a focus on food is what makes this book so great. I think most people will have some basic understanding of the timeline of events that happened in Russia over the last 100 years or so. But because the scope of these events is so large, it can sometimes feel a bit distant and a bit abstract. And I think by using food as a focus, which is such a universal thing, it makes this history a bit more palpable. It makes it easier to imagine what life was like to live in Russia at different stages throughout history, and it gives a glimpse in the psyche of the Russians. Another thing that the author brings up throughout the book is that you might not associate Russia with gourmet food, but food still plays such a big role in the lives of Russian people. But it might be more the lack of food, the empty stores, the waiting in line, the resourcefulness around meals, how all of that is a very big part of Russian culture. Yeah, so I really enjoyed this book and I would highly recommend this if you want to read a book on Russian history on a very personal level. Then I also read A Tomb with a View by Peter Ross. And I picked this up because Charlotte from Bookish Mama Blooms talked about it on her channel last year, and I think she even had it as one of her favorite books of the year. So in this book the author visits different graveyards around the UK and one in France. Just tells different stories about these graveyards. It could be something about the graveyards themselves as a place to be or as part of a landscape of a city. It could also be something on a smaller level, a story about a particular grave and the people buried there. It could be about a very prominent or a famous grave, or about graves that are neglected, about people that are long forgotten. I always find graveyards very interesting and soothing places to be in. There's like a certain feel of welcome I get from graveyards. I don't really know how to explain that very well, but I do feel that the author captures that in this book. Even though graveyards are obviously associated with death, which is in itself a very happy topic, he manages to weave through these stories a celebration of life, like a certain joyfulness and a certain tenderness. It makes you feel more connected to the death in a non-creepy way. I don't know, it just wasn't a book I expected to make me feel so positive. So yeah, it was definitely a pleasant surprise. And then finally I also read the entire Heartstopper series throughout the month. And I put them on the end because I am probably the literal last person on the planet to read these. So you probably don't need another person to tell you read this book because you likely already have. So I've been aware of these books for quite a long time, but they've never really been high priority for me. It is, you know, a book that I would come across from time to time and I think, you know, I'll read that someday. But I might also not. It's fine. So yeah, so when I spotted a copy of this in my local library at the beginning of the month, I picked it up having no expectations, because, you know, it's a book written for teenagers and I'm not really the target audience, but I just wanted to see what it was all about. So we check it out. I go to a nearby cafe, I order an oat flat white like the true millennial I am, and I open this book and I start reading it. And then as I go on, I notice there's this stupid grin forming on my face because this book is just so damn adorable and so precious. You know, if you want to look like a weirdo, read this book in public. So the next week, you think I'd learned a lesson? No, I do the same thing all over again. I get volume 2 from the library. I go to the cafe, I get my coffee. I have the stupid face. But this time there's also tears involved. Yeah, so by volume 3 and 4 I finally learned my lesson. And I read those at home without embarrassing myself. And I think what I found in these novels, and in the TV series as well, which I've been watching basically on a loop, it just sort of gave teenage me a hug when I didn't realize teenage me needed a hug. And I feel just this huge sense of excitement and hopefulness that these books have a place in the world, and that they are so popular and they reach such a big audience. I know, I just didn't expect to be so affected by them, and yeah, I'm just very, very happy I read them. And yeah, they're just very, very dear to me. So here we have all the books I read in October. I have definitely read some books that surprised me and gave me a lot to think about. So I'd say it was a successful reading month. I'd love to know how you all are, if you've read anything interesting lately. And I'll talk to you in a next video. Bye!